In Belle Meade, Tennessee, a 72-year-old grandmother was about to face crushing humiliation. What started as attending her son's wedding took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a daughter-in-law determined to destroy her dignity. Carol Hawkins wasn't your typical retiree. For 30 years, she had been Nashville's most feared corporate attorney, known for dismantling opponents who underestimated her. When Vanessa Price forced her to wear servant's rags while family wore designer gowns, Carol had no idea she was walking into a 3-year war. Her patient response would lead to legal devastation. What began as maternal heartbreak became strategic revenge. Nashville's elite would tremble after discovering their harmless grandmother had been building the case that would annihilate one of their own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Carol Hawkins smoothed her hands over her best navy dress one final time as she stepped out of her modest sedan in the circular drive of the Whitmore estate. The sprawling Belle Meade mansion rose before her like something from a Tennessee postcard, white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, manicured gardens stretching toward the Cumberland River Valley. She'd driven the 43 miles from her small house in the hills, her heart full of maternal joy and nervous anticipation. Today, her Jimmy was getting married. The parking area buzzed with valets directing luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs, a Bentley that caught the light like polished obsidian. Carol's 10-year-old Honda seemed embarrassingly out of place, but she squared her shoulders and walked toward the estate's grand entrance. After all, she'd earned her place here through 30 years of hard work and sacrifice, putting Jimmy through college and supporting him until he'd landed his position at the bank. A young woman in a black suit approached, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Hawkins?" "Yes, that's me." Carol smiled warmly, expecting to be directed toward the bride's preparation area. Perhaps Vanessa wanted to share a quiet moment before the ceremony, a chance for them to bond as mother and daughter-in-law. "Miss Price left specific instructions for you. If you'll follow me?" They walked through the estate's back entrance, past the main reception areas where Carol caught glimpses of elegantly dressed guests sipping champagne. The young woman led her to a small room near the service corridor where a simple black dress hung on a hook, the kind worn by catering staff, with a crisp white collar and modest length that fell well below the knee. "Miss Price thought you'd be more comfortable in this," the assistant said, her voice carefully neutral. "She mentioned you'd be helping with the family coordination today." Carol stared at the dress. Around her, she could hear the rustle of silk and taffeta from the main bridal suite, punctuated by laughter and the pop of champagne corks. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed Jimmy's cousin Sarah, adjusting a stunning emerald gown that probably cost more than Carol's monthly pension. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Carol said quietly, her attorney's mind automatically cataloging details. The assistant's uncomfortable expression. The deliberate placement of this room away from the main bridal preparations. The timing, less than an hour before the ceremony, when it would be too late to find alternative arrangements. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Miss Price was very specific. She said the family had discussed it and thought this would be appropriate." Carol's fingers traced the rough polyester of the servant's dress. 32 years ago, she'd worn a similar uniform while cleaning offices at night to pay for law school. She'd sworn her son would never see her in such clothing again, that she'd built something better for their family. But Jimmy had never seen those years. By the time he was old enough to remember, she'd already established her practice, already climbed out of the poverty that had defined her childhood in the Tennessee foothills. She'd told him stories about her humble beginnings, but they'd been just that to him. Stories from a past that seemed impossibly distant from their comfortable life. "Mrs. Hawkins?" The assistant shifted nervously. "The ceremony begins in 45 minutes. Carol took the dress from its hook with steady hands. "Of course. Thank you for clarifying." She changed in silence, each movement deliberate and controlled. The dress fit poorly, too tight across the shoulders, too loose at the waist. In the small mirror above the wash basin, she looked exactly like what Vanessa intended. Hired help. Invisible. Dismissible. When she emerged, other family members were gathering in the main foyer. Jimmy's Aunt Margaret wore a flowing lavender gown that complemented her silver hair beautifully. His cousins had clearly visited high-end boutiques, their dresses, a carefully coordinated symphony of pastels and sophisticated cuts. They looked like what they were, successful professional women attending a society wedding. Carol stood apart, watching. Nobody seemed surprised by her appearance. A few exchanged quick glances, but no one spoke up. No one questioned why the mother of the groom was dressed like the help. Jimmy appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his black tuxedo. His face lit up when he saw his family gathered, then faltered slightly when his gaze reached Carol. She watched him process her appearance, saw the moment of confusion, followed by what she recognized as his lifelong pattern, the swift mental adjustment that avoided conflict. "Mom, you look." He paused, clearly struggling. "Comfortable," she supplied gently, sparing him the awkwardness. I'm sure Vanessa had good reasons for her suggestions. Relief flooded his features. She's very thoughtful about making sure everyone feels included. Carol nodded, filing away his response alongside the growing list of observations her legal mind was automatically compiling. The way he'd avoided her eyes when he spoke, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the rehearsed quality of his words about Vanessa's thoughtfulness. The ceremony itself unfolded like a perfect society tableau. Carol was seated in the back row, while other family members occupied places of honor near the front. From her vantage point, she had an unobstructed view of the proceedings, and more importantly, of the guests' reactions. Vanessa was undeniably beautiful, gliding down the aisle in a gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her blonde hair was styled in elaborate waves, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant as she accepted the admiring murmurs from the assembled crowd. She looked every inch the successful socialite, marrying well within her established circle. But Carol watched the faces around her. She saw the subtle frowns when guests noticed her placement and attire, the whispered conversations behind raised hands, the uncomfortable glances in her direction. Eleanor Price, Vanessa's mother, sat in the front row wearing an expression of rigid composure that Carol recognized from her years in corporate boardrooms. It was the look of someone maintaining appearances while deeply troubled by what they were witnessing. During the reception, Carol found herself effectively invisible. Guests who might have engaged her in conversation seemed uncertain about her role. Was she family or staff? The ambiguity Vanessa had created served its purpose perfectly, isolating Carol from meaningful social interaction. The introduction came during the dinner hour, when Vanessa stood to acknowledge special guests and family members. Her voice rang clear and confident across the reception tent as she thanked various relatives and friends. And of course, Vanessa continued, her smile never wavering, we must acknowledge Jimmy's mother, Carol, who has been such a help with the coordination today. She insisted on being hands-on with the family preparations. Polite applause followed, but Carol caught the subtle implications in Vanessa's phrasing. Not Jimmy's mother, who raised this wonderful man, not Carol, who we're thrilled to welcome into our family. Instead, language that positioned her as helpful staff, appreciated, but clearly in a service role. From her table, Carol watched Eleanor Price's face tighten almost imperceptibly. Watched Jimmy's cousin Sarah lean toward her husband with a troubled expression. Watched the subtle ripple of discomfort move through guests who understood exactly what they were witnessing. But she also watched Vanessa's friends, young Nashville socialites, who nodded approvingly at their hostess's deft handling of a potentially awkward family situation. To them, this was simply proper management of social hierarchies. Carol was being kept in her appropriate place. As the evening wore on, Carol found herself studying Vanessa with the same analytical attention she'd once brought to opposing counsel in complex litigation. She observed the young woman's interactions with different social groups, charming and inclusive with those she considered peers, dismissive and cold with service staff, strategically warm with older relatives who might prove useful. When Eleanor Price approached Vanessa near the end of the reception, Carol was close enough to hear their exchange. "Darling, I'm concerned about the seating arrangements for Carol," Eleanor said quietly. "Perhaps there was some confusion." Vanessa's response was swift and smooth. "Oh, Mother, Carol specifically requested to help today. She told Jimmy she'd feel more comfortable being useful rather than just sitting around. Wasn't that sweet of her? The lie was delivered with such practiced sincerity that Carol almost admired its artistry. Almost. Eleanor's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but the wedding day was hardly the time for family confrontation. As guests began departing, Carol made her way to Jimmy for their goodbye. He looked tired beneath his happiness, the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day managing multiple delicate social situations. "Mom, I hope." He struggled for words. "I hope you understand. Vanessa just wants everything to be perfect." Carol reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture she'd made countless times throughout his childhood. "I understand perfectly, sweetheart. Your wife has made her priorities very clear." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely, but before he could respond, Vanessa appeared at his side, still luminous in her wedding gown, but with a subtle hardness around her eyes when she looked at Carol. "Mrs. Hawkins, thank you so much for all your help today. I hope you felt included." The pause before the final word was calculated, designed to emphasize the gap between inclusion and belonging. Carol met Vanessa's gaze steadily, recognizing a strategic mind behind the beauty, and understanding that she was looking at someone who had fundamentally underestimated her opponent. "It was illuminating," Carol replied evenly. "I learned so much about family priorities today." She kissed Jimmy's cheek, nodded politely to Vanessa, and walked toward her car with the same dignity she'd maintained throughout the long, humiliating day. Behind her, the reception continued its glittering celebration, but Carol's mind was already elsewhere, processing, analyzing, and beginning to plan. The drive home through the darkening Tennessee hills gave her time to think. In her rearview mirror, the lights of Nashville faded, but the lessons of the day remained crystal clear. Vanessa had revealed herself completely, her cruelty, her strategic thinking, and most importantly, her absolute certainty that Carol posed no threat to her plans. It was, Carol reflected as she pulled into her driveway, the kind of mistake that had cost many opponents dearly in courtrooms across Nashville. The assumption that quiet dignity meant weakness. The belief that someone could be dismissed simply because they chose not to fight back immediately. Carol sat in her car for a moment, looking at her modest home with its flower gardens and wide front porch. Tomorrow, she would begin the careful, methodical work of understanding exactly who her son had married. Tonight, she would simply remember the feeling of being deliberately humiliated by someone who thought her background made her expendable. She'd been underestimated before, by corporate executives who assumed a woman from rural Tennessee couldn't match their sophisticated strategies. Those men had learned, often too late, that quiet observation and patient preparation were far more dangerous than flashy confrontation. As she finally walked up her front steps, Carol's reflection in the porch light showed a woman still wearing a servant's dress, but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never forgotten how to fight. The wedding was over. The real battle was just beginning. Carol's hands trembled slightly as she hung the servant's dress in her bedroom closet, the coarse polyester fabric, a stark reminder of the day's humiliation. The drive home had given her time to process what had happened, but now, in the familiar sanctuary of her modest home, the full weight of Vanessa's calculated cruelty settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision, removing her makeup, brushing her silver hair, changing into the soft cotton nightgown that her late husband Robert had always said made her look like an angel. But tonight she felt anything but angelic. Tonight she felt like a woman who had been systematically diminished by someone who should have welcomed her as family. The phone rang at 9:30, just as Carol was settling into her reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea. Jimmy's name appeared on the caller ID, and she took a steadying breath before answering. "Hello, sweetheart. Mom, I wanted to call and thank you again for today. Vanessa said you were wonderful to work with." His voice carried the forced brightness of someone trying to convince himself as much as her. Carol set down her teacup carefully, her legal training kicking in even through her emotional exhaustion. "Work with? You know, helping coordinate everything. She mentioned how hands-on you wanted to be." There it was again. The narrative Vanessa had constructed, now being repeated by her own son. Carol had spent decades recognizing when opposing counsel was attempting to reframe facts, and she heard the same technique in Jimmy's words. "Jimmy, did you see what I was wearing today?" A pause. Too long. "You looked appropriate for the occasion." "Appropriate." Carol repeated the word slowly, tasting its implications. "Tell me, son, what did your cousins wear?" Another pause. "Mom, I don't really notice those things. You know I'm not good with fashion." It was a deflection, pure and simple, the same pattern she'd observed countless times in depositions. When someone knew the truth was damaging, they claimed ignorance or changed the subject. But this wasn't a corporate adversary trying to avoid liability. This was her son, choosing willful blindness over confronting his wife's cruelty. "How was the honeymoon planning coming along?" she asked, shifting tactics. "Actually, Vanessa's been handling most of that. She has such good taste, and honestly, she knows these luxury resorts better than I do. We're thinking somewhere in Europe, maybe the Amalfi Coast." Carol noted the casual mention of luxury travel, the easy assumption of expensive tastes. Jimmy made a good living at the bank, but not luxury European resort money. Not unless someone else was contributing to the lifestyle. That sounds lovely. I'm sure Eleanor must be excited about the destination. "Well, actually," Jimmy's voice grew uncomfortable. "Vanessa thought it might be better to keep it more intimate. Just the two of us. You know? She said the best honeymoons are when couples can focus entirely on each other." Translation: Vanessa was already isolating him from family influence. Carol had seen this pattern before, not just in legal cases, but in the domestic relations work she'd occasionally handled. Controlling partners systematically separated their targets from support systems, starting with the people who knew them best. "Of course," Carol said gently. "Young love needs its privacy." She could hear his relief at her understanding tone. "Exactly. You always get it, Mom. Vanessa said you'd understand better than most people." After they hung up, Carol sat in her reading chair, staring out at the Tennessee hills that had been her refuge for the past 5 years. When Robert died, she'd retired from her Nashville practice and moved back to the area where she'd grown up, a place where people knew her as Carol Hawkins, not as the sharp-edged attorney who'd made corporate executives sweat in boardrooms. But tonight, that retired attorney was stirring back to life. She pulled out her laptop and began what she'd always called preliminary research, the careful background work that preceded any major case. Vanessa Price had lived her entire life in Nashville's social spotlight, which meant there would be traces. Digital breadcrumbs of her activities, associations, and history. The first search yielded society page photos dating back to Vanessa's debutante ball. Always perfectly groomed, always photographed with the right people at the right events. But Carol's trained eye caught details others might miss. The subtle positioning that suggested social insecurity. The way Vanessa placed herself strategically next to more established figures, as if borrowing their status. A deeper dive revealed Vanessa's romantic history, and a troubling pattern emerged. 3 serious relationships before Jimmy, each with sons of prominent Nashville families. Each relationship had ended abruptly, often followed by the young men becoming notably distant from their families. One had moved to California shortly after their breakup. Another had married quickly. A rebound relationship that lasted less than a year. Carol made notes in the leather portfolio she'd always used for case preparation. Patterns of behavior, potential witnesses, timeline discrepancies. It felt familiar and energizing, like flexing muscles she'd forgotten she had. The doorbell rang at 10:15, and Carol smiled before she even looked through the peephole. Maggie Sullivan stood on the front porch, her silver hair slightly disheveled, her expression thunderous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Don't you dare tell me you're fine," Maggie announced as Carol opened the door. "I've been stewing about today for 3 hours, and I need to say my piece." Carol had known Maggie since they were 12 years old, growing up in the same rural community where being poor wasn't shameful, just challenging. Maggie had become a nurse, never married, and had appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of Carol's emotional well-being since Robert's death. "Come in," Carol said, grateful for her friend's predictable outrage. "I'll make more tea." "Tea, hell. This calls for bourbon." Maggie headed straight for Carol's kitchen, retrieving the bottle of Maker's Mark that Carol kept for special occasions. "What that little witch did to you today was unconscionable." Carol accepted the generous pour Maggie handed her. She made her position clear. "Her position?" Maggie's voice rose. "Her position should be grateful that she's marrying into a family with actual class and dignity. Instead, she humiliated the woman who raised the man she supposedly loves." Jimmy didn't seem to notice. Jimmy noticed. He's just choosing not to see it. Maggie settled into Robert's old chair, her expression fierce. "That boy has always taken the path of least resistance, and now he's married to someone who's going to use that weakness against everyone who loves him." Carol sipped her bourbon, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "She's very strategic. Everything today was calculated to establish hierarchy and control. You're analyzing her like a case study." "Because that's what she is." Carol met her friend's eyes. "Maggie, I spent 30 years dealing with people who thought they could manipulate situations to their advantage. Vanessa Price just made the mistake of treating me like I'm too old and too irrelevant to fight back." Maggie leaned forward, recognizing the tone she remembered from Carol's courtroom days. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that young woman has no idea who she just declared war on." Over the next hour, Carol shared her preliminary observations while Maggie listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. They'd both seen what happened to families when controlling people gained power. The slow erosion of relationships, the gradual isolation of victims, the way love could be weaponized. "She'll try to cut you out completely," Maggie warned. "That's how these people operate. Make Jimmy choose between his mother and his wife, knowing he'll choose the path of least resistance. Which is why I can't give her that opportunity." Carol pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I need to rebuild some professional relationships." Quietly. The first call went to Bobby Chen, her former protege who now worked for one of Nashville's most prestigious firms. Bobby had been a brilliant law student from a working-class family, exactly the kind of person Carol had always mentored. She'd guided his early career, helped him navigate the politics of elite legal circles, and watched with pride as he'd built his own reputation. "Mrs. H." Bobby's voice was warm with genuine affection. "I was just thinking about you last week. How are you enjoying retirement?" "It's been educational," Carol said carefully. "Bobby, I was wondering if you might have time for lunch soon. I'd love to catch up and hear about your recent cases." "Absolutely. Is everything okay? You sound like my old self?" Carol smiled. "Perhaps that's because some situations require old skills." They arranged to meet the following week, and Carol felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces beginning to move on a board. Bobby would be curious about her sudden desire to reconnect, but he'd also be loyal. He owed his career trajectory partly to her guidance, and more importantly, he respected her judgment. After Maggie left, Carol sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and legal pad, creating what she privately called a case file. At the top of the first page she wrote, "Vanessa Price Hawkins, Pattern Analysis and Strategic Response." Under that, she began documenting everything she could remember from the wedding, not just the humiliation, but the details that revealed Vanessa's methods and mindset. The way she'd positioned the service dress as Carol's choice, the language she'd used to introduce Carol at the reception, the subtle but deliberate isolation tactics. But most importantly, she noted Vanessa's fundamental miscalculation, the assumption that Carol's rural background and current quiet lifestyle meant she lacked the sophistication to recognize or counter strategic manipulation. As she worked, Carol felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond grief and loneliness. For 5 years, she'd been Carol the widow, Carol the retiree, Carol the small-town grandmother. But tonight, she was remembering who she'd been before all that. Carol Hawkins, the attorney who never lost a case when she had time to prepare properly. The grandfather clock in her hallway chimed midnight as she closed the laptop. Tomorrow, she would begin the careful, patient work of understanding her opponent's weaknesses and building an unassailable position. She'd learned long ago that the most devastating victories came not from emotional reactions, but from methodical preparation and strategic thinking. Vanessa Price thought she'd won the first battle by humiliating Jimmy's mother at her own son's wedding. What she didn't understand was that she'd actually just awakened an adversary who had never learned how to lose, and who now had all the time in the world to ensure that when the reckoning came, it would be complete and irreversible. The war for Jimmy's future, and for the protection of any grandchildren who might follow, had officially begun. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Carol Hawkins had settled into what appeared to be the peaceful routine of a retired grandmother. To any observer, she spent her days tending her garden, reading on her front porch, and making occasional trips to Nashville for shopping or medical appointments. What they couldn't see was the methodical intelligence gathering that had become her primary occupation. The first test of Vanessa's ongoing campaign came with the Christmas dinner invitation, or rather the carefully worded suggestion that Carol might enjoy joining the family celebration at Jimmy and Vanessa's new Belle Meade home. The house itself was a statement, a sprawling colonial that spoke of old money and established social position, though Carol's research had revealed it was purchased with a combination of Jimmy's modest savings and a substantial wedding gift from Eleanor Price. Carol arrived at precisely the requested time, carrying her traditional contribution of homemade cornbread and sweet potato casserole, recipes that had been in her family for generations. She'd dressed carefully in a navy wool dress that was elegant, but not ostentatious, understanding that Vanessa would be looking for any excuse to position her as either underdressed or trying too hard. Vanessa greeted her at the door wearing a stunning red silk dress that probably cost more than Carol's monthly pension. Her smile was picture-perfect, the kind that would photograph beautifully for the society pages but never quite reached her eyes. "Carol, how wonderful that you could make it. Come in, come in." Vanessa's voice carried the practiced warmth of a hostess who'd learned to perform graciousness. "I've set up a lovely spot for you with the younger crowd. I thought you'd enjoy the energy." The younger crowd turned out to be Jimmy's teenage cousins, gathered around a card table in what was clearly the breakfast nook rather than the formal dining room where the adults were seated. Carol found herself positioned at the children's table, quite literally, while Jimmy's other relatives occupied the mahogany dining set that dominated the main room. The symbolism was unmistakable. At family gatherings, seating arrangements communicated hierarchy and respect. Carol, the mother of the groom, the woman who had raised the host, had been relegated to eating with children who were discussing video games and high school drama. But Carol simply smiled and took her assigned seat, engaging the teenagers with genuine interest in their lives while internally cataloging every detail of the evening. She watched as Vanessa moved through her own home like a conductor orchestrating a carefully planned performance. The way she positioned herself in every conversation to be the center of attention. How she managed to make each guest feel simultaneously welcomed and slightly off balance. During dinner, Vanessa made a point of serving Carol's portion herself, a different meal entirely from what the other adults received. While the main table enjoyed herb-crusted lamb with wine reduction, Carol was presented with what appeared to be leftovers from a previous meal, plated with the kind of casual attention typically reserved for children who wouldn't notice the difference. "I remembered you mentioning you preferred simpler foods," Vanessa announced cheerfully, loud enough for the room to hear. "I made sure to set aside something more, appropriate for your tastes." Jimmy, seated at the head of the main table, glanced over with a brief flicker of discomfort before turning his attention back to his cousin David's discussion of the bank's quarterly performance. The same pattern from the wedding. Awareness followed by deliberate blindness. Carol ate her reheated leftovers without comment, but she filed away every detail. The public nature of the humiliation. The false justification that made it seem considerate rather than cruel. The way other family members exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. After dinner, as Carol helped clear dishes, a task that seemed to be expected only of her, she found herself alone in the kitchen with Jimmy's Aunt Margaret. "This isn't right," Margaret whispered, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "The way she treats you. It's unconscionable." Carol continued loading the dishwasher with steady hands. "Vanessa has very specific ideas about family dynamics." "Family dynamics? You're Jimmy's mother. You raised that boy practically single-handed after Robert got sick. And now she's treating you like hired help?" Carol's voice remained calm. "Yes, I've noticed the pattern." Margaret studied her with sharp eyes that reminded Carol why she'd always respected Jimmy's aunt. Margaret was a retired English professor, someone who understood subtext and power dynamics in literature, and apparently in family relationships as well. "You're documenting all this, aren't you?" Margaret said quietly. Carol met her gaze steadily. "I'm observing, learning, understanding who my son married." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "Because someone needs to be paying attention to what's happening here." The conversation was interrupted by Vanessa's bright laughter from the dining room, followed by her voice calling out, "Carol, could you help me find the good coffee cups? I want to serve the adults properly." The request was deliberate, another opportunity to position Carol as staff rather than family, while emphasizing the distinction between adults and presumably whoever Carol was meant to represent. But Carol simply dried her hands and went to assist, maintaining the gracious demeanor that Vanessa seemed determined to test. The following week, Carol made what appeared to be a casual phone call to Bobby Chen's office. She'd waited until after the holidays, understanding that the timing needed to seem natural rather than reactive. "Mrs. H, Happy New Year! How was your Christmas?" "Illuminating," Carol replied, settling into her home office chair. "Bobby, I was wondering if you might have time for that lunch we discussed. I have a proposition that might interest you." They met at the Capitol Grill, a restaurant where Carol had conducted countless business lunches during her active career. Bobby arrived looking prosperous and confident, his success evident in his tailored suit and the respectful way the staff greeted him. Carol felt a surge of maternal pride. She'd watched this young man transform from an uncertain first-year associate into one of Nashville's rising legal stars. "You look like retirement agrees with you," Bobby said as they settled into their booth. "It's given me time to think about what comes next," Carol replied, studying the menu she already knew by heart. "Bobby, I've been considering some consulting work. Nothing too demanding, but I find myself missing the intellectual challenge of legal strategy." Bobby's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of consulting?" "Because I have to tell you, there are plenty of firms that would pay handsomely for your expertise. I'm particularly interested in family law, domestic relations, the kind of cases where understanding human psychology is as important as understanding legal precedent." "That's not usually your area of specialty," Carol smiled. "I'm discovering that family dynamics can be just as complex as corporate litigation. Perhaps more so, because the stakes are often more personal." They spent the next hour discussing potential opportunities, but Carol's real objective was to begin re-establishing her professional network. Bobby mentioned several colleagues who specialized in family law, and Carol made careful mental notes about which firms handled high-profile divorce cases in Nashville's elite circles. "There's something else," she said as they finished their meal. "I'm curious about your firm's investigative resources. Hypothetically speaking, what kind of background research is typical in complex divorce cases?" Bobby's expression grew more serious. "Depends on what you're looking for. Financial investigations, behavioral documentation, asset tracing." "Mrs. H, is everything okay?" This seems like more than academic curiosity. Carol reached across the table and patted his hand with maternal affection. "Everything's fine, dear. I'm simply trying to understand how family law has evolved since I was actively practicing. The tools available now must be far more sophisticated than what we had 20 years ago." "Absolutely. Digital forensics, social media analysis, financial data mining. We can build comprehensive profiles of behavior patterns that would have been impossible to document in the past." "Fascinating," Carol murmured, though her mind was already processing how such tools might apply to documenting a pattern of psychological manipulation and deliberate family alienation. That evening, Carol received an unexpected visit from Eleanor Price. Jimmy's mother-in-law arrived without warning, her usual composure slightly frayed around the edges. Carol invited her in for tea, curious about what had driven Nashville's most composed society matron to her doorstep. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said without preamble, accepting the china cup with hands that trembled slightly. "For the wedding, for Christmas dinner, for my daughter's behavior." Carol studied the older woman's face, noting the careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the signs of stress and sleepless nights. "You're not responsible for Vanessa's choices." "Aren't I?" Eleanor's voice carried bitter self-recrimination. "I raised her to marry well, to maintain social position, to understand the importance of appearances. But I never taught her to be cruel." "What happened at Christmas dinner?" Eleanor's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "She called me the next day, laughing about how she'd managed the family dynamics at dinner. She described the seating arrangements, the different meals. She thought it was clever, strategic." Carol felt something cold settle in her chest. Vanessa hadn't just been cruel. She'd been proud of her cruelty. Proud enough to brag about it to her own mother. "Eleanor, may I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Has Vanessa displayed this kind of behavior before? With previous relationships?" Eleanor's face went pale. "How did you—" Yes, she has. There was a young man 3 years ago, Thomas Brennan. Lovely family, old Nashville money. Vanessa dated him for 8 months, and by the end, he barely spoke to his parents. They blamed her for the estrangement. What happened? Thomas broke off the engagement, said he couldn't marry someone who didn't respect the people he loved. Vanessa was furious. She'd already planned the wedding, chosen the venue, ordered invitations. Carol filed away the information. A pattern of behavior. A previous victim who'd found the strength to resist. Most importantly, a family who might be willing to share their experiences if approached carefully. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something else, and I hope you'll be completely honest with me." Eleanor nodded, her face tense. "Are you concerned about Jimmy's future happiness?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Eleanor Price was a woman who'd spent decades navigating Nashville society, where loyalty to family was paramount and public criticism was unthinkable. But she was also a mother who'd watched her daughter's true nature emerge over the past year. "I'm terrified for him," she whispered finally. "She's already isolated him from his friends. He barely calls me anymore, unless she's present. And the way she talks about his family, about you." Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "She has no respect for the people who made him who he is." Carol reached across and took the older woman's hand. "Then we need to document that. Carefully, quietly. Because if this marriage continues on its current trajectory, Jimmy's going to need people who can help him remember who he was before she started rewriting his history." Eleanor squeezed Carol's hand gratefully. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, just observe. Keep records of conversations, behavior patterns, anything that demonstrates how she manipulates family relationships. And Eleanor? If she's stealing from the family trust fund." Eleanor's face went white. "How did you know?" "Because I recognize the signs. The expensive house, the luxury lifestyle that exceeds their combined income, the way she positions herself as entitled to certain standards of living." Carol's voice grew gentle but firm. "I need you to gather financial documentation. Quietly. Because if she's committing fraud, that changes everything." As Eleanor prepared to leave, she turned back with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Carol, what kind of law did you practice before you retired? Corporate litigation, complex financial disputes, the kind of cases where people tried to hide assets and manipulate documentation to avoid accountability." Eleanor's smile was grim, but determined. "Then my daughter picked the wrong grandmother to antagonize." After Eleanor left, Carol sat in her study, updating her growing file on Vanessa Price Hawkins. The pattern was becoming clearer. A systematic approach to isolating and controlling romantic partners, combined with financial manipulation and a fundamental lack of empathy for anyone who didn't serve her purposes. But most importantly, Vanessa was getting overconfident. She was bragging about her cruelty, believing herself untouchable in her new position as Jimmy's wife. It was exactly the kind of mistake that had destroyed opponents in Carol's courtroom, the assumption that temporary advantage meant permanent victory. Carol opened her laptop and began drafting what appeared to be a casual email to Bobby Chen, thanking him for lunch and mentioning her growing interest in family law consulting. But embedded in the polite language was the beginning of something much more significant: the construction of a legal network that would be in place when the time came to act. The quiet war had begun in earnest. Vanessa might have won the initial battles through surprise and manipulation, but Carol was playing a longer game, one that required patience, preparation, and the kind of methodical strategy that had made her undefeatable in Nashville's corporate courtrooms. The Christmas dinner humiliation had been Vanessa's tactical victory, but it had also been her strategic mistake. Because now Carol knew exactly who she was dealing with, and more importantly, she knew that the cruelty was escalating, which meant the reckoning was coming. Vanessa just didn't know it yet. 18 months into Jimmy and Vanessa's marriage, Carol received the phone call she'd been both hoping for and dreading. Jimmy's voice crackled through her phone at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, breathless with excitement and exhaustion. "Mom, we had the baby." Sarah Beth arrived at 4 this morning, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and absolutely perfect. Carol's heart swelled with grandmother's joy, even as her strategic mind noted the timing of the call. 7:30 meant he'd waited over 3 hours to contact her, which suggested Vanessa had controlled even this moment, deciding when and how Carol would learn about her granddaughter's arrival. "Oh, Jimmy, congratulations. How's Vanessa doing?" "Tired but incredible. She was amazing through the whole thing." "Mom, I've never loved anyone more than I love them both right now." The genuine emotion in his voice made Carol's chest tighten. This was her son at his best, capable of profound love and devotion. It also made him vulnerable to someone who understood how to weaponize those very qualities. "When can I meet Sarah Beth?" A pause. Too long. "Well, Vanessa wants to rest for a few days. You know how it is with newborns. Lots of adjustments, establishing routines. Maybe next week?" Carol had raised Jimmy. She remembered those early days when visitors were precious connections to the outside world, when grandmothers were lifelines of wisdom and support. The delay wasn't about rest, it was about control. "Of course," Carol said gently. "Just let me know when it's convenient." 3 days later, she received a text message, not a phone call, with visiting instructions. 30 minutes, afternoon only. "Please don't bring anything scented, as the baby might be sensitive." Carol arrived at the designated time, carrying a bag of unscented baby supplies and the hand-knitted blanket she'd been working on for months. The house felt different now, more like a fortress than a home. Expensive baby monitors were positioned strategically throughout the rooms, and Carol noticed that the informal family photographs that had once dotted the mantel had been replaced with professional portraits of Jimmy, Vanessa, and now baby Sarah Beth. Vanessa emerged from the nursery looking radiant, despite the demands of new motherhood. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and she wore what appeared to be a designer nursing dress that probably cost more than most women's entire maternity wardrobe. "Carol, how sweet of you to visit. Sarah Beth is sleeping right now, but you can peek at her." The nursery was a magazine-worthy showcase of pale pink and cream, with furniture that looked more suited to photography than practical baby care. Sarah Beth lay in a pristine white crib, her tiny features peaceful in sleep. Carol felt the familiar rush of grandmother's love, fierce, protective, and immediate. "She's beautiful," Carol whispered, drinking in every detail of her granddaughter's face. "She is, isn't she? Perfect little features, just like her daddy, though I think she has my chin." Vanessa's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who'd produced exactly what she'd intended. Carol spent 27 of her allotted 30 minutes watching Sarah Beth sleep, because Vanessa maintained that waking the baby would disrupt carefully established feeding schedules. She left with her heart full of love for her granddaughter and growing dread about the child's future. That evening, while researching infant development milestones online, a grandmother's natural instinct, Carol discovered something that made her legal instincts snap to attention. A social media post from Daniel Wright, a Nashville real estate developer whose name had appeared peripherally in her research into Vanessa's social circle. The post was innocent enough, a photo from a downtown restaurant with the caption, "Celebrating new ventures with good friends." But in the background, clearly visible at a corner table, were Jimmy and Vanessa. The timestamp showed it was from the previous week, when Vanessa would have been 8 months pregnant. Carol cross-referenced the date with Jimmy's social media, where he'd posted about working late at the bank. Either he'd lied about his location, or he hadn't known about Vanessa's dinner companion. She began tracking Daniel Wright's online presence more systematically. Successful real estate developer, never married, with a reputation for high-end properties and even higher-end lifestyle. His Instagram showed expensive cars, luxury travel, and frequent appearances at Nashville's most exclusive social events, often with married women whose husbands were notably absent from the photos. More concerning was Wright's business model. His development company specialized in what he called heritage restoration, buying historic properties from financially distressed families and converting them into luxury condominiums. The process typically involved convincing elderly property owners to sell at below-market prices, often through high-pressure tactics that bordered on exploitation. Carol spent the following week building a comprehensive profile of Wright's operations, using the same investigative techniques she'd once applied to corporate malfeasance cases. Property records, business filings, client testimonials, and increasingly, complaints from families who felt they'd been manipulated into selling their homes for far less than they were worth. The breakthrough came when she discovered Wright's connection to Eleanor Price's family trust. 3 months before Jimmy and Vanessa's wedding, the trust had sold a valuable piece of downtown Nashville real estate to Wright's company for 60% of its assessed value. The buyer was listed as DW Heritage Holdings, and the transaction had been expedited through what appeared to be family pressure rather than careful consideration. Carol called Eleanor that evening, choosing her words carefully. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you had any recent dealings with Daniel Wright's development company?" The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. "How did you know?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been researching Nashville's real estate market, and his name keeps appearing in connection with undervalued property sales." "Eleanor, did Vanessa recommend him to you?" "She said he was a friend, that he specialized in helping old families modernize their holdings." The downtown property was just sitting there, generating minimal income, and she convinced me that selling to him would be more profitable than continuing to manage it myself. Carol felt her legal instincts crystallizing into certainty. "Eleanor, what was the property worth according to your last assessment?" $800,000. But Daniel said the market was declining, and that historical properties were becoming liabilities rather than assets. He offered $480, and Vanessa said it was fair. Carol closed her eyes, calculating the numbers. A $320,000 difference that had likely been split between Wright and Vanessa in some form. It was fraud, plain and simple, but proving it would require evidence of their arrangement. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Has any money from that sale found its way to Jimmy and Vanessa?" Another long pause. The down payment for their house. Vanessa said it was a wedding gift to help them get established properly. $60,000. Carol made careful notes, her legal mind already mapping the connections. If Vanessa had received kickbacks from Wright's purchase of Eleanor's property and then used that money for her own benefit, it constituted wire fraud and theft from a family trust. More importantly, it suggested a pattern of financial manipulation that could be documented and proven. The christening took place the following Sunday at Vanessa's church, a trendy, non-denominational congregation that attracted Nashville's younger elite. Carol arrived to find herself seated in the back row again, while Vanessa's friends occupied the front pews like a carefully arranged wedding party. During the reception, Carol watched Vanessa work the room with practiced efficiency, introducing Sarah Beth to friends and family, while maintaining careful control over who could hold the baby and for how long. When Carol's turn came, she was allowed exactly 3 minutes with her granddaughter before Vanessa smoothly retrieved the child with excuses about feeding schedules. But those 3 minutes were enough. Sarah Beth was alert and responsive, her dark eyes tracking faces and sounds with the kind of awareness that suggested intelligence and strong family genes. She was also clearly thriving, despite her mother's rigid scheduling, a resilient child who would need protection from the toxic dynamics already forming around her. As Carol prepared to leave the reception, she overheard a conversation between Vanessa and one of her friends that made her blood run cold. "She's already so attached to Jimmy's mother," the friend was saying, glancing toward Carol. "That could be problematic as she gets older." Vanessa's response was delivered with the casual cruelty Carol had come to recognize. "Oh, that won't be an issue. Carol won't have much access as Sarah Beth grows up. I'm planning to establish very clear boundaries about outside influences." The words hit Carol like a physical blow. Vanessa wasn't just isolating Jimmy from his family. She was planning to cut Carol out of her granddaughter's life entirely. Sarah Beth would grow up not knowing the woman who'd raised her father, not understanding her family history, not benefiting from the love and wisdom her grandmother could provide. That night, Carol made 2 phone calls. The first was to Bobby Chen, asking for an urgent meeting to discuss a complex family law matter that requires complete discretion. The second was to a private investigator she'd used during her corporate practice, someone who specialized in financial forensics and understood how to build legally admissible evidence of fraud and manipulation. The gloves were coming off. Vanessa had made her final strategic error by threatening Carol's relationship with her granddaughter. Everything that came next would be focused on protecting Sarah Beth and preserving Jimmy's chance at happiness, even if he couldn't see the danger yet. The quiet war was about to become much more active. 2.5 years into the marriage, Carol's investigation had evolved into something resembling the complex corporate cases that had once made her reputation. Her home office now contained 3 filing cabinets filled with meticulously organized documentation, financial records, photographs, witness statements, and digital evidence that painted a damning portrait of Vanessa's systematic manipulation and fraud. The breakthrough came on a humid July morning when Bobby Chen called with news that confirmed Carol's worst suspicions. "Mrs. H, you need to see this. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" Bobby's tone carried the same urgent professionalism she remembered from her most serious cases. When Carol arrived at his downtown firm, she found him waiting with a stack of documents and the grim expression of someone who'd uncovered something genuinely disturbing. "The Daniel Wright investigation paid off," he said without preamble. "We have evidence of systematic fraud involving at least 6 properties over the past 3 years. But more importantly, we have documentation of his financial relationship with Vanessa." Bobby spread the papers across his conference table like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Bank records, property transfers, shell company filings, and most damning of all, a series of cash deposits into an account registered under Vanessa's maiden name. She's been receiving payments from Wright's company disguised as, quote, consulting fees for heritage property evaluation. $25,000 here, $30,000 there, always just under the federal reporting requirements. Carol studied the documentation with the focused intensity that had once made opposing counsel nervous. How much total? Over 18 months, nearly $200,000. Money that she's been using to fund her lifestyle while Jimmy thinks they're living on his bank salary and her family's generosity. What kind of consulting could she possibly provide? She has no background in real estate or property evaluation. Bobby's smile was grim. According to the paper trail, she provides quote consulting to help Wright identify and approach property owners who might be vulnerable to pressure sales. Essentially, she's been serving as a social connection who can identify elderly Nashville families with valuable real estate and limited financial sophistication. The implications hit Carol like a physical blow. Vanessa had weaponized her social position and family connections, using her access to Nashville's elite elderly community to target them for financial exploitation. Eleanor's situation hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern. "Bobby, I need you to prepare something for me. Quietly." A comprehensive dossier on Vanessa's financial activities, her relationship with Wright, and documentation of her pattern of family manipulation. Something that could be used in legal proceedings if necessary. "Are we talking about divorce proceedings?" Carol met his eyes steadily. We're talking about protecting my granddaughter and my son from someone who's been systematically defrauding elderly families while destroying the relationships of anyone who gets close to her. That evening, Carol's strategic planning was interrupted by a phone call that sent her blood pressure soaring. Jimmy's voice was tight with barely controlled anger, but the anger was directed at her. "Mom, we need to talk. Vanessa showed me the restraining order papers today." Carol's mind raced. "What restraining order papers?" "Don't play innocent. The harassment complaint she filed with Metro Police." "Mom, how could you hire a private investigator to follow my wife?" The accusation hit like a slap. Vanessa had somehow discovered Carol's investigation and had twisted it into evidence of harassment and stalking. It was a brilliant countermove, positioning herself as the victim while making Carol appear to be an obsessed, vindictive mother-in-law. "Jimmy, I need you to listen to me carefully. I have never harassed your wife. I have been protecting our family from someone who what? Who married me? Who gave me a beautiful daughter. Mom, I know you've never liked Vanessa, but this has gone too far." Carol could hear Vanessa's influence in his words, the careful phrases that reframed 3 years of documented cruelty as simple personality conflict. "Son, did you know that your wife has been receiving payments from Daniel Wright's development company? She does consulting work, real estate evaluation. She's trying to build her own career instead of just depending on me." Another lie, delivered with Vanessa's typical blend of partial truth and strategic omission. Carol realized that Vanessa had been preparing Jimmy for this conversation, building a narrative that would explain away any evidence Carol might present. "Jimmy, has she mentioned that she wants to move the family out of state?" A pause. "We've talked about new opportunities. There might be a position for me in Charlotte, better advancement potential. But that's just preliminary discussions." Carol felt ice in her veins. Charlotte meant removing Jimmy and Sarah Beth from Nashville entirely, away from family support, away from anyone who might recognize Vanessa's manipulation, away from the legal jurisdiction where Carol could effectively protect them. When is this move supposed to happen? Nothing's decided. Maybe next year, maybe never. Mom, why are you asking all these questions? Why can't you just trust that I'm capable of making decisions about my own family? Because your family includes my granddaughter, Carol wanted to say. Because Vanessa is systematically destroying every relationship you value. Because you're being manipulated by someone who sees you as a means to an end, rather than a person worthy of love and respect. Instead, she said quietly, "I trust you completely, Jimmy. I'm concerned about the people who might be influencing your decisions." "You mean my wife, the mother of my child, the woman I chose to spend my life with?" His voice carried a finality that Carol recognized, the tone of someone who'd been coached to end conversations that became uncomfortable. After he hung up, Carol sat in her kitchen, staring at the phone and processing the new reality. Vanessa had escalated to legal warfare, using the court system to isolate Carol, while simultaneously preparing to remove Jimmy and Sarah Beth from Nashville entirely. It was a sophisticated strategy that demonstrated both desperation and tactical brilliance. But it was also a mistake. Because restraining orders required evidence, and Carol's investigation had been conducted within legal boundaries using professional resources. More importantly, Vanessa's move to legal action meant that Carol could now respond through official channels rather than private investigation. She called Bobby immediately. "The restraining order is baseless," he said after reviewing the paperwork. "Hiring a licensed investigator to research financial fraud isn't harassment, it's due diligence." "But Mrs. H, this changes the timeline significantly. If she's willing to use the courts against you, she's probably planning something bigger. The move to Charlotte. She's trying to remove them from Tennessee before anyone can intervene." "Then we need to move faster. What do you need me to do?" Carol looked out her kitchen window at the Tennessee hills where she'd been born, where she'd raised Jimmy, where she'd planned to watch Sarah Beth grow up. Vanessa was trying to erase all of that, to cut the family connections that had sustained multiple generations. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive legal strategy. Something that protects Sarah Beth's relationship with her Tennessee family while exposing Vanessa's financial crimes." "And Bobby?" "Yes, ma'am. I need it to be devastating. Complete. The kind of case that doesn't just win, It ensures the problem never resurfaces. The next morning brought Eleanor Price to Carol's door, carrying a banker's box filled with documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd reached a breaking point. "I can't stand by anymore," Eleanor announced, setting the box on Carol's kitchen table. "These are financial records from the family trust, correspondence with Daniel Wright, and recordings of conversations I've had with Vanessa over the past 6 months." Carol stared at the box. "Recordings? My phone has been automatically recording our calls since I upgraded last year. I forgot about the feature until yesterday, when I realized what those conversations actually revealed." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly. "Carol, my daughter has been systematically stealing from the family trust and using the money to fund a lifestyle that Jimmy believes is being supported by legitimate means." Together, they spent the morning reviewing documents that painted an even more damning picture than Carol's investigation had revealed. Vanessa hadn't just received kickbacks from Wright's development deals. She'd been actively steering elderly Nashville families toward his company, using her social connections and her mother's reputation to gain access to vulnerable property owners. The recordings were particularly devastating. Vanessa's voice, clear and unguarded, describing her targets with clinical detachment. "The Morrison family is perfect. Old money, valuable property, and no children who understand modern real estate markets. I can have Daniel approach them through the heritage preservation angle." "She's a predator," Eleanor said quietly, her voice heavy with maternal grief. "I raised a predator, and now she's using everything I taught her about social connections to harm other families." Carol reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "You didn't create this, but we can stop it." That afternoon, Carol and Bobby met with Detective Maria Santos from the Metro Nashville Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Santos listened with growing interest as they laid out the evidence of Vanessa's fraud ring, her systematic manipulation of elderly property owners, and her use of the proceeds to fund a false lifestyle. "This is significantly more sophisticated than typical family dispute cases," Santos observed. "We're looking at wire fraud, elder abuse, theft from trust funds, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. If you can substantiate all of this, she's facing serious federal charges." "What about the restraining order she filed against Mrs. Hawkins?" Santos smiled grimly. "Based on what you've shown me, it looks like a classic deflection strategy. File accusations against the person investigating your crimes to muddy the waters and buy time. We see it frequently in white-collar cases." As they left the police station, Carol felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death: the satisfaction of a complex puzzle coming together. All the pieces were in place. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal strategy was sound. But most importantly, Sarah Beth's future was finally protected. When this case concluded, Vanessa would be facing criminal charges that would prevent her from taking Sarah Beth anywhere. Jimmy would have to confront the truth about his wife's character, and Carol would have her granddaughter safely within reach of the family love that every child deserved. The quiet war was about to become very public indeed. And this time, Carol wouldn't be fighting alone. 3 years to the day after the wedding that had started it all, Carol's phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. Jimmy's voice was raw, broken in a way she'd never heard before. "Mom, I need to come over." "I can't." "I found them together." Carol was already reaching for her car keys. "I'll come to you, sweetheart." "Number. Vanessa's here, and she's—" "Please, can I just come home?" 20 minutes later, Jimmy sat at Carol's kitchen table, looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes held the shell-shocked expression of someone processing a fundamental betrayal. "I came home early from the bank yesterday," he said quietly. "Sarah Beth had been asking for me all week, and I thought I'd surprise them. The house was quiet, so I went upstairs." His voice broke. Carol poured coffee with steady hands, giving him time to gather himself. "They were in our bedroom, Vanessa and Daniel Wright. And when she saw me, she didn't even look ashamed, she just angry, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by coming home to my own house." "What did she say?" Jimmy's laugh was bitter. "That it was my fault, that I'd been distant and distracted, that successful women need partners who understand their ambitions, not small-town bank managers who can't appreciate sophistication. Quote. Carol felt rage bubble up in her chest, not just at Vanessa's cruelty, but at her tactical brilliance. Even caught in adultery, she'd managed to position herself as the victim of Jimmy's inadequacy. She said you'd poisoned me against her, that you'd been filling my head with suspicions and jealousy for 3 years. Jimmy looked up at his mother with haunted eyes. Mom, have you been investigating her? The moment of truth. Carol met her son's gaze steadily. Yes. Why? Because I love you. Because I love Sarah Beth. And because I recognized what she was doing to our family from the very first day. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, processing this confirmation of what Vanessa had been telling him. What did you find? Carol retrieved her files from the office, laying out 3 years of careful documentation. Financial records showing Vanessa's fraud scheme with Daniel Wright. Recordings of her describing vulnerable elderly families as targets. Evidence of the systematic theft from Eleanor's trust fund. She's a criminal, Jimmy. A sophisticated one, but a criminal nonetheless. And she's been using you as cover while she defrauds Nashville's elderly community. As Jimmy absorbed the evidence, Carol watched him transform. The hurt and confusion in his eyes hardened into something she recognized from her own reflection during her most challenging cases. The cold determination of someone who'd been pushed too far. She wants everything in the divorce, he said finally. The house, Sarah Beth, spousal support. She's claiming I'm an unfit father under the influence of a vindictive mother-in-law. Carol smiled for the first time in 3 years. Then she's about to learn what vindictive actually looks like. The war was finally in the open, and Carol had been preparing for this battle longer than Vanessa could possibly imagine. The Davidson County Family Court buzzed with the kind of tension that preceded high-profile cases. Vanessa arrived in a black Chanel suit, flanked by Harold Blackwood, Nashville's most expensive divorce attorney, and playing the role of grieving wife perfectly. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief as photographers captured her entrance. Jimmy sat beside Bobby Chen at the defendant's table, his transformation from broken husband to determined father evident in his posture. But the real surprise was the woman seated quietly in the gallery's front row, Carol Hawkins, no longer hiding in the shadows. Judge Patricia Whitman entered with the no-nonsense bearing that had made her reputation during her prosecutorial days. Her eyes swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Carol with what might have been recognition. Blackwood opened with theatrical flair. Your Honor, my client is a devoted mother fleeing an abusive household, where she's been systematically harassed by a vindictive mother-in-law who refuses to accept her son's marriage. Mrs. Price Hawkins seeks only to protect her daughter from further psychological damage. He painted Vanessa as a victim of Carol's, quote, obsessive investigation and Jimmy's emotional instability, requesting full custody, the house, and substantial alimony. The performance was polished, but Carol noticed Judge Whitman's expression growing cooler with each melodramatic flourish. Bobby's response was surgical. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Price Hawkins has been engaged in systematic fraud, elder abuse, and financial manipulation for over 3 years. Far from being a victim, she's been the architect of a scheme that has defrauded multiple Nashville families of their life savings. The first bombshell came when Bobby introduced Daniel Wright's arrest record, charges filed just that morning for wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Wright had been found with detailed files on elderly property owners, including handwritten notes in Vanessa's recognizable script. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly as photographs of her handwriting were displayed on the courtroom monitors. Detective Santos testified about the investigation's scope. We've identified at least 12 elderly victims who were targeted through Mrs. Price Hawkins's social connections. The total financial loss exceeds $2 million. Eleanor Price's testimony devastated Vanessa's case entirely. The dignified matriarch described how her own daughter had manipulated her into selling family property at below market value, then used the proceeds to fund a lifestyle that deceived her husband about their true financial situation. She told me it was smart business, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, but she was stealing from her own family to maintain an illusion. The afternoon brought Sarah Beth's court-appointed advocate, who had spent weeks evaluating the family dynamics. Her report was damning. Evidence of emotional manipulation, deliberate alienation of paternal family members, and a household environment focused on appearances rather than the child's emotional well-being. As Blackwood desperately tried to shift blame to Carol's interference, Judge Whitman's patience finally snapped. "Counsel, are you seriously arguing that documenting criminal activity constitutes harassment? Because from where I sit, Mrs. Hawkins appears to have been protecting this family while your client was systematically defrauding hers." When court adjourned, Vanessa's mask had completely fallen away, replaced by the cold calculation Carol had first glimpsed 3 years ago at the wedding reception. The next phase would determine everything. The courtroom fell silent as Carol Hawkins walked to the witness stand. At 72, she moved with the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout this ordeal, but there was steel in her spine that everyone present could feel. Judge Whitman administered the oath personally, her voice carrying unusual solemnity. Bobby Chen approached the witness stand with the reverence due a master craftsman about to demonstrate her expertise. "Mrs. Hawkins, please tell the court about your professional background." "I practiced corporate litigation in Nashville for 32 years, specializing in complex financial fraud cases. I never lost a case where I had adequate time to prepare." Carol's voice was clear, measured, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded boardrooms and courtrooms across Tennessee. "Why did you begin investigating your daughter-in-law?" Carol turned slightly toward the gallery, where Jimmy sat watching his mother with new understanding. "Because from the moment I met Vanessa Price, she demonstrated a pattern of calculated cruelty, designed to isolate my son from his family. The wedding day humiliation was just the beginning. She described the servant's dress, the deliberate seating arrangements, the systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that had followed. But unlike a victim recounting trauma, Carol presented each incident as evidence in a carefully constructed case. "Mrs. Hawkins, did you document these incidents?" "Every single one." Carol gestured toward the evidence table where Bobby had arranged 3 years' worth of meticulous records. Photographs, recordings, witness statements, financial records. "I treated Vanessa's behavior like any other case of systematic fraud, because that's exactly what it was." Blackwood objected repeatedly, but Judge Whitman overruled him each time with increasing sharpness. The evidence was overwhelming and legally obtained through professional investigators and Carol's own observations. Bobby introduced Carol's comprehensive dossier, a masterwork of legal documentation that traced Vanessa's manipulation techniques, her financial crimes, and her systematic alienation of Jimmy from his support network. Each piece built upon the others, creating an unassailable portrait of deliberate, calculated destruction. "The defendant's counsel wants you to believe that a mother investigating her daughter-in-law constitutes harassment," Carol said, looking directly at the judge. "But when that daughter-in-law is committing felonies while psychologically abusing your son and planning to relocate your granddaughter to escape accountability, investigation becomes a moral imperative." The courtroom gallery murmured as Carol described discovering the Charlotte relocation plan, Vanessa's attempt to remove Jimmy and Sarah Beth from Tennessee before the fraud investigation could conclude. When Blackwood rose for cross-examination, his usual confidence had evaporated. "Mrs. Hawkins, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment against my client since the wedding?" Carol's smile was razor-sharp. "Mr. Blackwood, I've harbored awareness since the wedding. There's a significant difference. You hired private investigators to follow my client. I hired licensed professionals to investigate financial crimes being committed against Nashville's elderly community. Your client's involvement became apparent through the evidence, not through targeting her specifically." Blackwood attempted to portray Carol as a vindictive mother-in-law, but every question backfired. Carol's responses were precise, backed by documentation, and delivered with the calm authority of someone who had faced far more skilled opponents in much higher-stakes cases. The breaking point came when Blackwood, clearly desperate, made a fundamental error. "Mrs. Hawkins, don't you think a woman of your age should focus on enjoying retirement rather than destroying families?" Judge Whitman's gavel came down sharply. "Counsel, that question is out of line." but Carol raised her hand slightly. "I'll answer, Your Honor. A woman of my age has the wisdom to recognize predatory behavior and the experience to document it properly. I didn't destroy this family, Mr. Blackwood. I documented its destruction by your client and gathered the evidence necessary to protect the innocent victims, my son and granddaughter." The afternoon session brought Daniel Wright to the stand, now facing federal charges and eager to cooperate. His testimony was devastating. Detailed descriptions of how Vanessa had identified vulnerable elderly families, coached him on approach strategies, and split the proceeds from fraudulent property sales. "She called them heritage projects," Wright testified, his voice hollow. "Said we were helping old families modernize their assets. But really, we were stealing from people who trusted Vanessa because of her social position and her mother's reputation." Wright produced bank records showing payments to Vanessa, totaling over $300,000 across 18 months. Money she'd used to fund the lifestyle that had impressed Jimmy and convinced him they were financially secure. Eleanor Price returned to the stand for redirect examination, her testimony now focused on the theft from the family trust. She described finding missing heirlooms, discovering unauthorized withdrawals, and realizing that her daughter had been systematically looting the estate that was meant to provide security for future generations. "She took my grandmother's jewelry, sold it, and told me it had been lost during a move," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "When I found the sales receipts in her desk, I realized that nothing I owned was safe from her schemes." The final witness was Sarah Beth's pediatric psychologist, who had been secretly documenting concerning behaviors during court-ordered evaluations. Her testimony painted a picture of a child caught between a loving but manipulated father and a mother who viewed her as a possession rather than a person. Sarah Beth shows signs of anxiety when discussing her grandmother Carol, the psychologist testified. But when pressed, she reveals that her mother has forbidden her from talking about Grandma Carol at home and has told her that her grandmother doesn't really love the family. As the day concluded, Vanessa sat rigid in her chair, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. The mask of wounded innocence had been systematically destroyed by 3 years of careful documentation and strategic preparation. Judge Whitman's expression was granite as she reviewed the evidence. "I'll render my decision tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." Walking out of the courthouse, Carol felt the weight of 3 years lifting from her shoulders. The truth was finally in the open, documented and witnessed. Vanessa's web of lies and manipulation lay exposed in all its calculated cruelty. Tomorrow would bring justice. Tonight, Carol could finally sleep peacefully, knowing she had protected her family with the same precision and determination that had made her undefeatable in Nashville's corporate courtrooms. The quiet war was ending, and Carol Hawkins had won it exactly as she'd planned, methodically, completely, and irreversibly. Judge Patricia Whitman entered her courtroom the next morning, carrying herself with the gravity befitting what everyone knew would be a landmark decision. The gallery was packed beyond capacity. Word of the case's revelations had spread through Nashville's legal and social communities like wildfire. Eleanor Price sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, while Carol maintained her characteristic composure beside Jimmy and Bobby Chen. Vanessa had arrived wearing subdued gray instead of her usual designer armor, her legal team clearly having coached her to appear humble rather than defiant. But Carol could see the rage simmering beneath her daughter-in-law's carefully controlled expression. "Be seated," Judge Whitman commanded, her voice cutting through the courtroom's tension. "I have reviewed all evidence presented in this matter, consulted relevant precedents, and considered the best interests of the minor child involved. This court's decision will be comprehensive." She began with the divorce settlement itself, methodically dismantling Vanessa's financial claims. Mrs. Price Hawkins' request for spousal support is denied. Evidence clearly demonstrates that she has been fraudulently enriching herself throughout this marriage, while deceiving her husband about their true financial circumstances. The house, Vanessa's primary demand, was awarded to Jimmy along with full custody of Sarah Beth. This court finds that Mrs. Price Hawkins has demonstrated a pattern of psychological manipulation designed to alienate the child from her paternal family. Such behavior is contrary to the child's best interests and will not be rewarded. But Judge Whitman was just beginning. More concerning to this court is the evidence of systematic elder abuse and financial fraud perpetrated by Mrs. Price Hawkins. These crimes extend far beyond the scope of this divorce proceeding. She turned her attention directly to Vanessa, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades on the bench. Mrs. Price Hawkins, you have used your social position and family connections to target vulnerable elderly citizens for financial exploitation. You have stolen from your own mother's family trust. You have defrauded multiple Nashville families of their life savings while maintaining a facade of respectability. The gallery was absolutely silent, as Judge Whitman continued. This court is referring your case to both the Davidson County District Attorney and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The evidence suggests violations of federal wire fraud statutes, elder abuse regulations, and conspiracy charges. Vanessa's lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear, but she shook him off, her composure finally shattering completely. "This is ridiculous," she burst out, rising from her chair. "That woman," she pointed directly at Carol, "has orchestrated this entire thing. She's obsessed with destroying me because she can't accept that Jimmy chose me over his pathetic family." "Mrs. Price Hawkins, you will sit down and remain silent," Judge Whitman commanded, her voice like ice. But Vanessa was beyond control now, 3 years of careful manipulation collapsing into raw fury. She's a bitter old woman who can't stand that her son found someone better than his small-town background. "Everything I did was to elevate this family, to give them the social position they deserved." "Bailiff," Judge Whitman called calmly. As the bailiff approached, Vanessa's voice rose to near hysteria. "You have no idea what it's like being surrounded by people with no ambition, no sophistication. Jimmy would still be a nobody bank manager without me. His mother would still be wearing her Walmart dresses to family dinners." The mask was completely off now, revealing the woman Carol had always known was hiding beneath the performance. Every word Vanessa spoke confirmed the psychological evaluation's conclusions about her fundamental lack of empathy and her view of other people as tools for her advancement. Judge Whitman waited until Vanessa was restrained before continuing. "Mrs. Price Hawkins, your outburst has confirmed this court's assessment of your character and judgment. You are hereby held in contempt, and I am ordering immediate psychiatric evaluation before sentencing on the criminal charges." She turned to Jimmy, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Hawkins, this court recognizes that you have been a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation. You will retain full custody of your daughter, with the understanding that Mrs. Price Hawkins's visitation rights are suspended, pending resolution of the criminal proceedings." The financial restitution was staggering. Vanessa was ordered to repay the trust fund theft in full, return all fraudulently obtained assets, and compensate the elderly victims identified in the investigation. When the numbers were totaled, her debt exceeded $800,000, money she no longer had access to since the fraud accounts had been frozen. Finally, Judge Whitman said, looking directly at Carol, "This court wishes to acknowledge Mrs. Carol Hawkins. Your methodical documentation of these crimes has not only protected your family, but has exposed a systematic pattern of elder abuse that might otherwise have continued unchecked. Your actions represent the highest traditions of the legal profession." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. As the courtroom erupted in conversation, Carol felt Jimmy's hand slip into hers for the first time in 3 years. His eyes were wet with tears. Grief for the marriage he'd thought he had, relief at finally seeing the truth, and gratitude for the mother who had never stopped protecting him. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it." "You saw what she wanted you to see," Carol replied gently. "That's what predators do. They're very good at creating illusions." Eleanor Price approached them, her face streaked with tears but her bearing resolute. "Carol, I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than words can express. My daughter, what she became. I failed as a mother." Carol took Eleanor's hands in both of hers. "You didn't create her choices, but you found the courage to stop enabling them. That takes extraordinary strength. Outside the courthouse, Nashville's media had gathered to cover what was already being called the Belle Meade fraud case. Carol declined interviews, but Bobby Chen spoke briefly about the importance of protecting elderly citizens from sophisticated financial predators. Detective Santos approached Carol as they reached their cars. "Mrs. Hawkins, I wanted you to know. The FBI is using your documentation as a model for investigating elder fraud cases. Your methodology was flawless." Carol smiled. 30 years of corporate litigation teaches you to build unassailable cases. I just applied those skills to protecting my family. That evening, Carol sat on her front porch watching Jimmy and Sarah Beth play in her garden. Sarah Beth, now 3 years old, was finally free to love her grandmother without fear or restriction. She ran toward Carol with the uninhibited joy of a child who felt completely safe. "Grandma Carol, Daddy says I can come visit you every weekend now." "That's right, sweetheart. We're going to have wonderful times together." As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, Carol reflected on the journey from humiliation to justice. Vanessa was facing 5 to 10 years in federal prison, her social position destroyed, her financial crimes exposed to the very community she'd tried so hard to impress. But more importantly, Jimmy was free to rebuild his life with dignity intact, and Sarah Beth would grow up surrounded by family members who loved her for who she was, rather than what she represented. The quiet war was over. And as Carol had learned long ago in courtrooms across Nashville, the most devastating victories came not from emotional outbursts, but from patient preparation and the inexorable power of truth properly documented and strategically revealed. Justice, as it turned out, was a dish best served methodically. 6 months after Judge Whitman's verdict, Carol's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined during those dark early days of Vanessa's reign. The modest house in the Tennessee hills that had once felt like a refuge from the world had become the vibrant center of a rebuilt family's life. Sarah Beth's laughter echoed through the rooms every Saturday morning as she helped her grandmother make pancakes, a ritual that had quickly become sacred to both of them. At 3.5, Sarah Beth was blossoming into a confident, joyful child who no longer flinched when asked about her family or worried about saying the wrong thing around adults. "Grandma Carol, can we pick flowers for Daddy's house?" Sarah Beth asked, syrup smeared across her cheek as she finished her breakfast. "Of course, sweetheart. Your daddy loves having fresh flowers on his table." Jimmy had moved into a smaller house closer to Carol's, deliberately choosing simplicity over the Belle Meade mansion that had never really belonged to him anyway. The federal seizure had claimed most of Vanessa's assets, but Jimmy seemed relieved rather than resentful about the loss of luxury. He was rediscovering who he was beneath the person Vanessa had tried to reshape him into. "Mom, I've been thinking," Jimmy said as he arrived to pick up Sarah Beth that afternoon. "Would you consider coming back to some legal work? Part-time consulting, maybe?" Carol looked up from the flower arrangement she and Sarah Beth had created together. "What kind of consulting?" "Bobby Chen called me yesterday. Apparently your case has generated inquiries from families across Tennessee who think they might have been targeted by similar fraud schemes. There's talk of creating a specialized elder protection unit with the Attorney General's office." The idea stirred something in Carol that had been dormant since her retirement. During her corporate practice, she'd always found the most satisfaction in cases where she could protect the vulnerable from sophisticated predators. The Vanessa case had reminded her how much she missed that sense of purpose. "I'd need to be selective," she said carefully. "Sarah Beth is my priority now." "Of course. But Mom, what you did, the way you built that case, other families need that kind of protection. And honestly, I think you need it too. You're too sharp to spend all your time gardening." That evening, after Sarah Beth had been tucked into her car seat with promises of another weekend adventure, Carol called Bobby Chen to discuss the consulting opportunity. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Mrs. H, we've had 12 inquiries just this week from families who suspect financial manipulation by people in their social circles. The Vanessa case exposed a whole network of these predators, and we need someone with your expertise to help identify the patterns." What about the other victims from Vanessa's scheme? Have they been able to recover anything? That's actually the best news. The Morrison family got their downtown property back. The sale was voided due to fraud. 3 other families have recovered significant portions of their losses through the asset forfeiture proceedings. Your documentation made it possible to unwind most of the damage. Carol felt a warmth that had nothing to do with Tennessee's autumn sunshine. The work had been worth it, not just for her own family, but for the other elderly victims who might have spent their final years in financial distress because of Vanessa's greed. There's something else, Bobby continued. Eleanor Price wants to fund a legal clinic specifically focused on elder protection. She's calling it the Heritage Protection Project, helping families preserve their legacies from predators who target their social connections. The irony wasn't lost on Carol. Eleanor was reclaiming the very concept that Vanessa and Daniel Wright had corrupted, turning heritage preservation back into something that actually protected families rather than exploiting them. A month later, Carol found herself back in a Nashville office building, though this time in a suite designed for consultation rather than litigation. The Heritage Protection Project occupied 2 floors, with Carol serving as senior consultant, while younger attorneys handled the day-to-day casework. Her first case involved a Chattanooga family whose matriarch had been pressured into signing over her farm to a two-full consultant, who promised to modernize the property while allowing her to remain in the family home. The consultant had disappeared with the deed, leaving the 84-year-old woman facing eviction from land her family had owned for 6 generations. It's the same pattern, Carol explained to the team of attorneys working the case. Identify vulnerable elderly property owners, gain their trust through social connections or false credentials, then exploit their unfamiliarity with modern legal and financial systems. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that corporate litigation had never been. Instead of protecting companies' profit margins, Carol was preserving families' legacies and protecting people's life savings from sophisticated thieves. Eleanor Price visited the clinic regularly, her own transformation as remarkable as her family's healing. The dignified matriarch who had once enabled her daughter's cruelty through willful blindness had become a fierce advocate for elder protection. Her social connections, once exploited by Vanessa, now served as an early warning system for potential fraud. I failed to protect my own family from the predator I raised, Eleanor told Carol during one of their monthly strategy meetings. But perhaps I can help protect other families from the predators my daughter's case has revealed. The criminal proceedings against Vanessa concluded in December with a plea agreement that sent her to federal prison for 7 years. Daniel Wright received 12 years for his role as the primary architect of the fraud scheme. Both were ordered to pay millions in restitution to their victims, though most of the stolen money had been spent on the lifestyle that was meant to attract more victims. Carol attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but to provide closure for the families who had suffered. Vanessa, dressed in a prison jumpsuit rather than designer clothing, looked diminished and bitter. She showed no remorse during her brief statement to the court, instead blaming her victims for being, quote, too trusting, and her family for failing to appreciate her ambitions. Judge Whitman's response was swift and sharp. Mrs. Price Hawkins, your lack of remorse confirms this court's decision. You will serve the full term without possibility of early parole. As they left the courthouse, Jimmy walked beside his mother with Sarah Beth sleeping peacefully in his arms. The little girl was completely secure now, surrounded by family members who loved her unconditionally and protected her fiercely. Do you think she'll ever understand what she threw away? Jimmy asked, glancing back toward the courthouse where Vanessa would begin her journey to federal prison. Carol considered the question as they reached her car. She never understood what she had in the first place. That's what made her so dangerous, and ultimately what made her so self-destructive. That Christmas, Carol's house overflowed with family for the first time in years. Jimmy and Sarah Beth, Eleanor Price, Margaret Sullivan, Bobby Chen and his parents, even Detective Santos and her family, all gathered around the table where Carol served the same recipes her own grandmother had made decades earlier. Sarah Beth, now comfortable and confident in her grandmother's house, insisted on saying grace. "Thank you for Grandma Carol, and Daddy, and all the people who love us," she said in her clear 3-year-old voice. And thank you that the bad people can't hurt families anymore. Later, as Carol tucked her granddaughter into the guest room that had been transformed into Sarah Beth's weekend sanctuary, the little girl asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Grandma Carol, why did Mommy try to keep me away from you?" Carol smoothed Sarah Beth's hair with gentle hands, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people make choices that hurt the people who love them. But you don't need to worry about that anymore. You're safe, and you're surrounded by people who will always protect you. Will you always be here when I need you?" "Always, sweetheart." That's what grandmothers are for. As 2025 ended and 2026 began, Carol reflected on the journey that had brought her family to this point. 3.5 years earlier, she'd been a humiliated mother watching her son's wedding become a nightmare of deliberate cruelty. Tonight, she was a grandmother whose patient strategy had not only saved her family, but had created a legacy of protection for other vulnerable families across Tennessee. The Heritage Protection Project had already helped 43 families recover stolen assets or prevent fraudulent schemes. Carol's methodology was being studied by law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. And most importantly, Sarah Beth was growing up in an environment where she was loved for who she was, rather than manipulated for what she could provide. Standing on her front porch, looking out at the Tennessee hills that had witnessed generations of her family's struggles and triumphs, Carol Hawkins smiled. She'd learned that the most powerful victories weren't won through immediate retaliation or emotional outbursts, but through the patient accumulation of truth and the strategic application of justice. Vanessa Price had thought she was destroying a harmless old woman who couldn't fight back. Instead, she'd awakened an adversary who understood that the best revenge was a life well lived, a family well protected, and justice carefully served. The quiet war was over. The healing had begun. And Carol Hawkins had finally found her way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,